After Stalingrad, the Eastern Front was a strategic deadlock. But in 1943, Hitler prepared one final, desperate offensive. An enormous gamble to reclaim the initiative with a new generation of supertanks. Today, we explore the largest tank battle in history. A clash where German might met a Soviet defense so vast, so deep, that the world would witness the death of the Blitzkrieg doctrine. The field, the Kursk salient. This is the battle where Germany ran out of miracles. This is the Battle of Kursk. In the spring of 1943, following the catastrophic German defeat at Stalingrad, the Eastern Front had settled into an uneasy equilibrium. The Germans had retreated hundreds of miles from their furthest advance, abandoning the Caucasus, falling back across southern Russia. But they had not collapsed. They had established new defensive lines, brought up reinforcements, and remained a formidable military force. And now, in the warming days of April and May 1943, Adolf Hitler and his generals were planning one final throw of the dice, one last great offensive that would, they believed, restore German fortunes on the Eastern Front and wrest back the strategic initiative from the Soviet Union. This is the story of the Battle of Kursk, Operation Citadel, the largest tank battle in history, the last major German offensive in the East, and the battle that would seal Germany's fate on the Eastern Front. The objective of Operation Citadel was simple to describe but enormously difficult to execute. During the winter campaigns following Stalingrad, Soviet forces had driven deep into German-held territory around the city of Kursk, creating a massive bulge, a salient, that protruded westward into the German lines. This salient was approximately 150 miles wide and 100 miles deep, a huge fist of Soviet-held territory jutting into the German front. From a German perspective, the Kursk salient was both a danger and an opportunity. It was a danger because Soviet forces could launch attacks from the salient into the flanks of German positions to the north and south. But it was also an opportunity because the salient itself was vulnerable to encirclement. A classic pincer movement, attacking from north and south simultaneously, could cut off the salient at its base, trapping the Soviet forces inside. Hitler believed that a successful offensive at Kursk would achieve multiple strategic objectives. It would destroy a significant portion of the Red Army's combat power, perhaps 50 divisions trapped and destroyed in the pocket. It would shorten German defensive lines, freeing up troops for use elsewhere. It would demonstrate that the Wehrmacht retained offensive capability despite Stalingrad. And perhaps most importantly for Hitler, it would restore German prestige and morale after the disasters of the winter. But there was a problem: timing. The original plan called for an attack in April or early May 1943, immediately after the spring thaw when the ground became firm enough for armored operations. But Hitler delayed. And delayed again. And again. The reason for the delays was Hitler's insistence on waiting for new tanks, specifically the Panther and Tiger tanks that were entering production in 1943. These vehicles represented the cutting edge of German armored technology. The Tiger I, already in limited service, mounted an 88mm gun and had armor up to 100mm thick, virtually impervious to most Soviet anti-tank weapons at normal combat ranges. The Panther, a new design, was intended to counter the Soviet T-34, combining excellent armor protection with a powerful 75mm gun and good mobility. Hitler believed that these new tanks would be war winners, that their technological superiority would offset Soviet numerical advantages and enable the Wehrmacht to break through Soviet defenses with acceptable casualties. But waiting for the new tanks came at an enormous cost. It gave the Soviets time. Every week that passed was another week for the Soviets to prepare defenses, to position reserves, to fortify the Kursk salient. And critically, it gave Soviet intelligence time to discover German intentions and prepare countermeasures. By June 1943, when Hitler finally set the date for the offensive, July 5th, the Soviets had been preparing for 2 months. They knew the attack was coming. They knew where it would strike. They knew the German objectives. And they had used the time to prepare the most formidable defensive system ever constructed. How did the Soviets know? The answer lies in one of the great intelligence successes of the war. Soviet spy networks operating in Germany and occupied Europe provided information about German planning. But more significantly, the British, who had broken German Enigma codes through the Ultra program, shared intelligence with the Soviets, albeit carefully, to avoid revealing that the codes had been broken. By late May 1943, Soviet commanders knew not just that an attack was coming, but where, when, and in what strength. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, Stalin's most trusted military advisor, recommended not launching a preemptive attack but instead allowing the Germans to attack into prepared defenses, bleeding them white, and then launching powerful counteroffensives to destroy the weakened German forces. Stalin, for once, listened to military advice. The Soviets would prepare their defenses, allow the Germans to attack, absorb the blow, and then counterattack. It was a strategy that required enormous confidence and enormous defensive preparations. But beyond intelligence and strategy lay the question of equipment. The German offensive would rely heavily on armor, tanks and assault guns supported by infantry and air power. The Germans committed approximately 2,700 tanks and assault guns to Operation Citadel, including 200 Tigers and 200 Panthers, the most powerful armored force Germany had ever assembled for a single operation. These vehicles were technologically superior to most Soviet tanks. A Tiger could destroy a T-34 at ranges where the T-34's gun could not penetrate the Tiger's armor. A Panther was faster, better protected, and more powerfully armed than the standard T-34. But the Soviets had advantages of their own. They had approximately 5,000 tanks available in and around the Kursk salient, nearly twice the German number. Many were T-34s, the excellent medium tank that had proven its worth since 1941. Others were heavy tanks, KV-1s and the new IS-2s, with thick armor and powerful guns that could match or exceed the German heavy tanks. More importantly, Soviet industry was producing tanks in enormous numbers. German factories struggled to produce 25 Panthers per month in mid-1943. Soviet factories were producing 1,200 T-34s per month. The Germans could not afford to lose tanks faster than they could replace them. The Soviets could. By early July 1943, everything was in place. The German forces, Army Group Center under Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge in the north, and Army Group South under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein in the south, were positioned for the attack. Soviet forces under Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky in the north and Marshal Nikolai Vatutin in the south waited in their defensive positions. The largest deliberate battle in history was about to begin, and it would be fought not just with tanks and guns, but with intelligence, preparation, and sheer industrial might. The defensive preparations undertaken by Soviet forces in the Kursk salient during April, May, and June 1943 were staggering in scale. This was not merely digging trenches and positioning artillery. This was the construction of the most comprehensive, most layered defensive system ever built. The Soviets established 8 successive defensive belts extending back from the front line for over 100 miles. Each belt consisted of trenches, bunkers, artillery positions, and anti-tank strongpoints. Between the belts lay minefields, approximately 400,000 mines laid in the northern sector alone, 340,000 in the south. Anti-tank ditches, some 15 feet deep, stretched for miles. Artillery was positioned in concentrated groups, ready to deliver devastating fire on attacking forces. Behind the defensive belts waited the reserves, fresh divisions, tank armies, artillery corps, positioned to counterattack once the German offensive had exhausted itself. Soviet commanders did not intend merely to survive the German attack. They intended to destroy the attacking forces, then launch their own offensives that would drive the Germans back hundreds of miles. The scale of effort was unprecedented. Over 300,000 civilians worked alongside soldiers to construct the defenses. In 2 months, they dug 3,000 miles of trenches, built over 30,000 firing positions, and laid enough barbed wire to stretch from Moscow to Berlin and back. On the night of July 4th to 5th, 1943, German forces prepared for the attack. Tanks moved into assault positions. Infantry battalions received final orders. Artillery batteries registered their targets. The offensive would begin at dawn, or so German commanders believed. But Soviet intelligence knew the exact timing of the attack. And Marshal Rokossovsky, commanding in the northern sector, decided to disrupt the German preparations with a preemptive strike. At 2:30 a.m. on July 5th, hours before the planned German attack, Soviet artillery opened fire along the northern front. Over 600 guns bombarded German assembly areas, catching troops and armor in the open, disrupting communications, creating chaos. It was a masterstroke, not enough to stop the German offensive, but enough to throw it off balance from the very start. When the German attack finally began at approximately 5:30 a.m., it did so against defenses that were fully alert, fully manned, and expecting exactly where the blow would fall. In the northern sector, Field Marshal Walter Model's 9th Army attacked with 18 divisions, including 6 panzer divisions. Their objective was to drive south toward the city of Kursk, linking up with forces attacking from the south and closing the pocket. But Model's forces immediately encountered the depth and strength of Soviet defenses. The first defensive belt was heavily fortified. When German engineers attempted to clear paths through the minefields, they came under intense artillery fire. When tanks advanced, they ran into pre-sighted anti-tank positions. When infantry attempted to assault Soviet strongpoints, they were cut down by machine gun and mortar fire. Progress was measured in hundreds of yards, not miles. Each defensive position had to be reduced individually: artillery bombardment, infantry assault, tank support, then move forward to the next position and repeat. German casualties mounted rapidly. Tanks were disabled by mines, destroyed by anti-tank guns, or knocked out by Soviet tanks positioned in defensive ambush positions. By the end of July 5th, Model's forces had advanced perhaps 6 miles at the deepest point of penetration, far short of the day's objectives. And Soviet reserves were already moving forward to contain the breach. In the southern sector, General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf attacked with somewhat better results. Hoth commanded some of the finest panzer divisions in the Wehrmacht, including the elite Leibstandard SS Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions, equipped with Tigers, Panthers, and other modern equipment. These forces made better initial progress than Model in the north. By July 6th, they had penetrated the first 2 defensive belts in several places and were advancing toward the third belt. But the advance was costly, and Soviet resistance was stiffening with each mile gained. Soviet commanders in the south, particularly Marshal Vatutin, fed reserves into the battle carefully, trading space for time, allowing the Germans to advance but making them pay for every mile with blood and burnt-out tanks. The Germans were being drawn deeper into the defensive system, further from their supply bases, closer to the mass of Soviet reserves waiting further back. By July 9th, Hoth's forces had advanced approximately 25 miles, significant progress, but still far short of breaking through the Soviet defensive system. And German losses were mounting alarmingly. The Panthers, rushed into combat before their mechanical problems had been resolved, were breaking down at alarming rates. The Tigers, though nearly invulnerable to Soviet anti-tank fire at range, were being disabled by mines or by close-range attacks. Both sides recognized that the battle was reaching its crisis point. The Germans had penetrated deep into Soviet defenses but had not achieved a breakthrough. The Soviets had absorbed enormous punishment but had not broken. German reserves were largely committed. Soviet reserves, particularly the powerful 5th Guards Tank Army, remained uncommitted, positioned behind the lines, waiting. Marshal Vatutin, commanding Soviet forces in the south, decided to commit his reserves. On July 12th, the 5th Guards Tank Army, commanded by General Pavel Rotmistrov, would counterattack near the small village of Prokhorovka, attempting to halt the German advance and perhaps throw them back entirely. The German forces in the area were primarily the 2 SS Panzer Corps, 3 elite SS Panzer divisions equipped with some of the best tanks in the world. They were exhausted from a week of continuous combat, but still formidable. They were advancing toward Prokhorovka, intending to break through the last Soviet defensive belt and drive toward Kursk. The 5th Guards Tank Army was fresh, well equipped with approximately 800 tanks, and determined to stop the German advance. The collision of these two forces at Prokhorovka would produce the largest tank battle in history. Both sides understood what was at stake. If the Germans broke through at Prokhorovka, they might yet achieve their objective of encircling Soviet forces in the Kursk salient. If the Soviets stopped them, the German offensive would be effectively over, having achieved nothing decisive. Everything, the months of preparation, the intelligence war, the technological race, the sacrifices of the previous week, came down to what would happen in the fields around Prokhorovka on the morning of July 12, 1943. Soviet tankers received their orders the night before: advance at dawn, close with the German tanks as rapidly as possible, fight at close range where Soviet numerical superiority and the maneuverability of the T-34 would offset German advantages in armor and firepower. It would be costly, casualties would be heavy, but it would stop the German advance. At dawn on July 12, Rotmistrov's tanks formed up and prepared to attack. Across the fields, German tankers in their Tigers and Panthers did the same. And the stage was set for one of the most dramatic armored clashes in military history. At approximately 8:30 a.m. on July 12, 1943, the 5th Guards Tank Army began its attack. Hundreds of Soviet tanks, primarily T-34s and T-70 light tanks, surged forward across the rolling fields south of Prokhorovka. They advanced in waves, engines roaring, tracks churning up dust, turrets traversing to engage German positions. The German defenders, 2 SS Panzer Corps, saw them coming. Tigers and Panthers opened fire at long range, their powerful guns capable of destroying T-34s at distances of 1,500 meters or more. Soviet tanks began exploding, brewing up in flames, their crews killed instantly or desperately bailing out of burning vehicles. But the Soviet tanks kept coming. This was the essence of Rotmistrov's tactics: accept the losses at long range, close the distance as rapidly as possible, get into close combat where the T-34's maneuverability and the sheer weight of numbers would overcome German technological advantages. At close range, 500 meters or less, a T-34's 76mm gun could penetrate even a Tiger's armor if it hit the right spot. Within minutes, the battlefield dissolved into chaos. Hundreds of tanks maneuvering at high speed across the fields, firing at point-blank range, ramming each other when ammunition ran out. Smoke from burning vehicles obscured visibility. Dust clouds raised by tank tracks made it nearly impossible to identify friend from foe. Radio communications broke down. Unit cohesion dissolved. It became a chaotic melee. Individual tank duels fought at ranges measured in meters. A Tiger, its thick armor impervious to frontal hits, would be attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, T-34s firing at its thinner side and rear armor, hoping for a penetrating hit. A Panther, superior in almost every technical specification to the T-34, would be overwhelmed by 3 or 4 T-34s attacking from different angles. Soviet light tanks, with guns too weak to penetrate German heavy armor, would attempt to ram German tanks or get close enough to throw grenades at vision ports and hatches. The fighting was intimate, brutal, and utterly without mercy. Tank crews that bailed out of disabled vehicles were shot by enemy infantry or machine-gunned by tanks. Wounded men crawled between burning vehicles, trying to reach safety. The noise was overwhelming: engines, guns, exploding ammunition, men screaming. By midday, the battlefield was a graveyard of destroyed armor. Burnt-out hulks of tanks littered the fields, Soviet and German mixed together, some still smoldering, some exploded, some merely disabled and abandoned. The dead lay where they had fallen, tankers who had escaped burning vehicles only to be cut down by enemy fire, infantrymen caught in the armored maelstrom, medics killed trying to reach the wounded. Estimates of the numbers engaged vary, but modern historians believe approximately 500 to 800 Soviet tanks and 200 to 300 German tanks were involved in the fighting at Prokhorovka and the surrounding area on July 12. It was, without question, the largest tank battle in history, and one of the costliest. Soviet losses were catastrophic. The 5th Guards Tank Army lost approximately 400 tanks destroyed or disabled, more than half its strength, in a single day. Thousands of tankers were killed or wounded. Entire battalions were effectively destroyed. It was one of the most costly single-day actions for Soviet armored forces in the entire war. But German losses, while lighter in absolute numbers, perhaps 70 to 100 tanks destroyed or damaged, were equally significant in relative terms. The Germans could not afford to lose tanks at this rate. They had committed their best formations, their newest equipment, their most experienced crews, and they were being ground down without achieving decisive results. More critically, the German offensive had been stopped. Rotmistrov's attack at Prokhorovka, despite its enormous cost, had achieved its objective. The German advance had been halted. The last Soviet defensive belt had held. And the possibility of a German breakthrough, of closing the Kursk pocket and achieving the objectives of Operation Citadel, had been eliminated. German commanders recognized this. Field Marshal von Manstein, commanding Army Group South, reported to Hitler that while his forces had inflicted heavy losses on the Soviets, they had not broken through and could not break through without significant reinforcements, which were not available. Hitler, monitoring the battle from his headquarters in East Prussia, was receiving other alarming news. On July 10th, American and British forces had landed in Sicily, beginning the invasion of Italy. Germany's Italian ally was on the verge of collapse. German forces would be needed in the Mediterranean to shore up defenses. The Eastern Front offensive, which had already consumed enormous resources without achieving decisive results, could not be sustained. On July 13th, the day after Prokhorovka, Hitler summoned his commanders to a meeting. He announced that Operation Citadel would be called off. German forces would go on to the defensive. Units would be withdrawn from the Kursk sector and sent to Italy or held in reserve for other operations. Von Manstein protested. His forces, despite the setback at Prokhorovka, were still combat effective. The Soviets had suffered enormous losses. Given time and reinforcements, the offensive might yet succeed. Why call it off now, after so much had been sacrificed? But Hitler was unmoved. The opportunity for decisive victory at Kursk had passed. The strategic situation required German forces elsewhere. Operation Citadel was over. It was, in retrospect, the correct decision, perhaps the only strategically sound decision Hitler made regarding the Eastern Front in 1943. Operation Citadel had failed. Continuing it would only consume more German strength without achieving the objectives. Better to cut losses and shift to the defensive. But the decision had enormous consequences. It meant that Germany would never again launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front. From July 1943 onward, the initiative would belong to the Soviet Union. The Germans would fight defensively, attempting to hold ground, to delay the Soviet advance, to buy time for something. But they would never again seriously threaten to defeat the Soviet Union militarily. For the Soviets, the outcome of Kursk was vindication of their strategy. Zhukov's recommendation, to allow the Germans to attack into prepared defenses, bleed them white, then counterattack, had worked perfectly. The Germans had launched their offensive with their best forces, their newest equipment, after months of preparation. And they had been stopped. Soviet losses had been heavy, perhaps 200,000 casualties in the defensive phase of the battle, along with hundreds of tanks destroyed. But the losses had been sustainable. Soviet industrial production continued to churn out replacement tanks, guns, and aircraft. Fresh divisions were available to replace those that had been ground down in the fighting. And now, with the German offensive broken, it was time for the Soviets to attack. Even before Hitler officially called off Operation Citadel, Soviet forces in the northern sector had launched their own offensive. Operation Kutuzov, beginning on July 12, struck at the German salient around Ural, north of Kursk. Soviet forces, including fresh armies that had not been committed during the defensive battle, attacked with overwhelming force. German Ninth Army, exhausted from a week of attacking Soviet defenses at Kursk, found itself under attack from multiple directions. Field Marshal Model, commanding in the north, requested permission to withdraw. Hitler, reluctantly, agreed. The withdrawal from Ural began, conducted under intense Soviet pressure, with heavy German casualties. In the south, the Soviets launched Operation Polkovodets-Rumyantsev on August 3, driving toward Belgorod and Kharkov. These offensives, unlike the desperate defensive actions of the previous week, were carefully planned, well-supported operations that steamrolled over weakened German defenses. German forces retreated, sometimes in good order, sometimes in near-out, giving up ground that had been held since 1941. The psychological impact was enormous. German soldiers, who had advanced so far in 1941 and 1942, who had believed they were winning the war, now found themselves in continuous retreat, losing ground day by day, with no prospect of stopping the Soviet advance. The Battle of Kursk, the defensive phase, Prokhorovka, and the subsequent Soviet counteroffensives officially ended on August 23, 1943. By that date, Soviet forces had recaptured both Ural and Kharkov, had pushed the Germans back dozens of miles along the entire central and southern front, and had created the conditions for further offensives that would continue through the autumn and winter. The cost had been staggering. Combined casualties for both sides exceeded 1 million, killed, wounded, missing. Thousands of tanks and aircraft had been destroyed. Entire divisions had been shattered. But the strategic outcome was clear. Germany had launched its last great offensive in the east and had failed completely. From Kursk onward, the pattern of the Eastern Front was set. The Soviets would attack. The Germans would retreat or attempt to hold, would suffer heavy casualties, would retreat further. Every month would bring the Red Army closer to Poland, to Romania, to Hungary, to Germany itself. The road from Kursk to Berlin would take nearly 2 years and would cost millions more lives. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. Kursk was the beginning of the end. The immediate aftermath of Kursk was a series of rolling Soviet offensives that pushed German forces back across a broad front. Operation Kutuzov, targeting the Ural salient, and Operation Polkovodets-Rumyantsev, driving toward Belgorod and Kharkov, were only the beginning. Through August, September, and into the autumn, Soviet forces maintained relentless pressure, allowing the Germans no time to rest, to rebuild, to establish stable defensive lines. The pattern was consistent. Soviet attacks, supported by massed artillery and armor, would hit German positions. If the Germans held, the Soviets would pause, bring up more artillery, and attack again. If the Germans retreated, the Soviets would pursue. German counterattacks, when they came, were increasingly local and limited, tactical reactions rather than strategic operations. The strategic initiative had passed completely to the Soviet Union, and it would never return to Germany. Every German success, and there would be local successes, tactical victories, well-executed defensive actions, was temporary, a delay rather than a reversal. The overall trajectory was clear: Soviet advance, German retreat, Soviet advance. The Battle of Kursk marked several crucial turning points. First, it was the last time Germany would be able to mass sufficient forces for a major offensive operation in the east. The losses in armor and experienced personnel at Kursk, combined with the growing need to defend other fronts, particularly in Italy and later France, meant that Germany would never again have the concentration of force necessary for strategic offensive operations. Second, Kursk demonstrated that German technological advantages were insufficient to overcome Soviet numerical superiority and improving Soviet tactics. The Tiger and Panther tanks, while formidable weapons, were not war winners. They were expensive, complex, difficult to maintain, and available in insufficient numbers. When a Tiger broke down, and mechanical problems were endemic, especially with the Panther. It often had to be abandoned for lack of recovery vehicles or spare parts. Soviet tanks, particularly the T-34, were simpler, more reliable, and produced in vastly greater numbers. A T-34 was inferior to a Tiger in almost every technical specification, but Soviet factories could produce 10 T-34s for every Tiger Germany built. And in warfare, quantity has a quality all its own. For the soldiers who fought at Kursk, on both sides, the battle was a defining experience. German veterans spoke of it as the moment they realized the war was lost, that no amount of courage or technical superiority could overcome the sheer weight of Soviet manpower and production. Many German soldiers at Kursk were veterans of the early campaigns, Poland, France, the initial advance into the Soviet Union. They had experienced victory, had believed in ultimate German triumph. Kursk shattered those illusions. Soviet soldiers remembered Kursk differently, as proof that the Red Army could not only survive German attacks but could defeat them decisively. The victory at Stalingrad had been seen by some as a fluke, a lucky encirclement. Kursk was different. At Kursk, Soviet forces had met the best the Wehrmacht could field in a deliberate battle and had defeated them comprehensively. Kursk also needs to be understood in the context of the broader war in mid-1943. The Battle of the Atlantic was turning in favor of the Allies, U-boat losses were mounting, and Allied shipping was increasingly safe. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany was intensifying, with American daylight raids complementing British night bombing. Italy was on the verge of leaving the war. Mussolini would be overthrown in July 1943, and Italy would sign an armistice in September. The global balance had shifted decisively against the Axis powers. Germany faced enemies on multiple fronts, all growing stronger while Germany grew weaker. Japan, having lost the initiative in the Pacific after Midway, faced growing American power. The Axis powers were doomed, though the war would continue for 2 more years of bitter fighting. The casualty figures from Kursk are disputed. Soviet records were incomplete or deliberately falsified, German records were lost or destroyed. But the general scale is clear. Combined casualties exceeded 800,000, possibly over 1 million. Both sides lost thousands of tanks and aircraft. The material cost was staggering. But unlike previous battles on the Eastern Front, where both sides suffered enormously but the strategic situation remained fluid, Kursk had a clear outcome. Germany had gambled on one last offensive and had lost. The initiative passed to the Soviet Union and would not return. From Kursk onward, the question was not whether the Soviet Union would win, but when, and at what additional cost. The Battle of Kursk. Operation Citadel. July 5 through August 23, 1943. The largest tank battle in history. The last major German offensive on the Eastern Front. The point where Germany's defeat became not just likely but inevitable. Hitler had delayed the offensive, waiting for wonder weapons that would restore German fortunes. But the delay had only given the Soviets time to prepare defenses so deep, so comprehensive, that even Germany's best forces could not break through. The technological advantages Hitler had waited for were real but insufficient. And the strategic opportunity, if it had ever existed, had been squandered. Today, the fields around Prokhorovka are peaceful farmland. Memorials mark the sites of the fighting, a massive monument to the Soviet tank crews who fought there, smaller markers for individual units and battles. Occasionally, farmers still unearth the remnants of the battle, shell casings, tank tracks, sometimes even human remains. But the significance of what happened there remains clear. Kursk was where the Wehrmacht's offensive power was broken, where Germany's technological advantages proved insufficient, where the Red Army demonstrated it could meet and defeat the best Germany could field, and where the outcome of the war in the East, and perhaps of the entire Second World War, was decided. The road to Berlin had begun at Stalingrad. It continued through Kursk, and it would end, 22 months later, in the ruins of the Reichstag. Kursk, the last German offensive, the beginning of the end. Kursk was the last chance for the German military machine. The colossal expenditure of men, oil, and, crucially, brand new armor, tanks that could not be replaced, was irreversible. The Red Army, though it suffered staggering losses, had the industrial capacity and the manpower reserves to absorb the blow and fight on. The victory confirmed the Soviet Union's dominance. From the summer of 1943 onward, the strategic initiative belonged entirely to the Red Army, which began a continuous westward advance that would eventually end in Berlin. Kursk was not just a battle won, it was the definitive defeat of the Nazi war effort in the East. If you want to understand the monumental forces of industrial war and the moments that seal a nation's fate, make sure you subscribe to History of Conflicts. Hit that notification bell and leave a comment below. We want to know, was the fatal delay in launching Operation Citadel, or the crucial Allied intelligence coup, the ultimate reason for the German defeat at Kursk? Thanks for watching.